Well, good afternoon. This is Mark Skidmore. I'm the director of the North Central Regional Center for Rural Development, and today, welcome to today's webinar. So today's webinar is entitled Hispanic Serving Institutions and Emerging Hispanic Serving Institutions in the Midwest. Our two presenters are Renee Rosenbaum from Michigan State University and Stephen Janetta from University of Missouri. And this project was done in collaboration with Wei Li, also of Michigan State University. Nationally, over half of all Latino undergraduate students in higher education enroll in the 472 institutions in the U.S. identified as Hispanic serving institutions. Despite the impact of Latino students and the community despite the impact on Latino students and the communities they serve, these institutions are largely unrecognized in the current literature. So this webinar presents the results of a study on these institutions here in the Midwest, using mixed methods to examine the characteristics of these institutions and the roles they and their faculty and administrators play in the development of Latino students and their communities. Before we get started, I just wanted to also note that we have a busy month of webinars, and you can see on the screen there that we have a webinar tomorrow as well as next week. So keep note of the ongoing activity of the Center's webinars. And so with that, we will move the current presentation into your view. And for those who would like to offer a question or a comment, you can do that in the chat section below. And so with that, I'd like to pass it on to Renee and Stephen. Thanks so much for being here and giving the webinar.
Thank you, Steve. We appreciate the opportunity to speak to our work over the past year or so. We'll get started. Steve, I'm joined by Steve Janetta, who will take on the presentation later on as part of this effort. So we'll get started. I want to start with some basic definitions because I don't know that the audience, and I want to make certain that we all had a basic understanding of what we're going to go through and analyze. But we're looking at Hispanic Serving Institutions and Emerging Hispanic Serving Institutions. And as you can read from the slide, Hispanic Serving Institutions has a basic definition. There are a variety of definitions. We're going to stay with the basic definition, which is accredited and degree granting public or private nonprofit institutions with an enrollment of undergraduate full-time equivalent students that is at least 25% Hispanic. And in 2016, there was a total of 491 in 21 states and Puerto Rico. And we also have emerging Hispanic serving institutions that are defined as nonprofit degree granting institutions with full-time equivalent undergraduate Hispanic student enrollment of at least 15% but less than 25%. And in 2016, the total there was 333 in 36 states and the District of Columbia. The defining characteristic of Hispanic serving institutions is the Hispanic enrollment and not their mission. We want to look at Hispanic institutions, first of all, as a political project, because if you, it's an invention that occurred, began to develop in the 1980s through advocacy by institutional leaders in Texas and New Mexico. Then former Senator Paul Simon took on the issue in 1984, and then it became a state issue in 1987 through some legislation by MALDEF. And in 1999, it was introduced again into Congress and became legislation. And in 1995, the first appropriations of $12 million under the program, Development Institutions Program for HSIs, occurred. So it's been a political project, and it's important to recognize that. Also, as a political project, it's been an academic project. We look at the link between long-term economic projections and sustainability to the educational levels of Latino community, accelerating the Latino educational achievement in higher education a matter of immediate attention. So as a matter of immediate attention, we examined the impact of Hispanic Serving Institutions on Latino students. So the focus since the creation of Hispanic Serving Institutions has been on assessing and increasing the impact of HSIs on Latino students. Service is seen as in terms of servicing the Latino student broadly defined. In addition to recruitment and enrollment, retention, persistence, and graduation are important measures of service. Community engagement and support programs also matter. So that's been what has dominated the discourse. And what we want to do is see how we can think in terms of HSIs and EHSIs as Latino community development, as a community development project. Okay, so what we'll be doing here in the next few slides is examining the causal links between population growth and the growth of HSIs and EHSIs. And then we'll examine the increases in Hispanic population in communities and how that leads to increases in Hispanic student enrollment, and how that leads to increases in Hispanic serving institutions and emerging serving institutions. So we'll lay that out for you, and then we'll ask the question, well, how is it that Hispanic serving institutions and emerging Hispanic serving institutions lead to Latino community development? Do they contribute to the prosperity of the Hispanic population as individuals and as members of the communities where they are located? How are these institutions engaged with the Latino community? How are their opportunities? What are their opportunities and challenges to involvement in the local community? So those are the type of issues we try to address in this paper. And it's a regional analysis. Very little work has been done on a regional basis. Most of the work that's been done on HSIs is on a national basis. And the regional attention is important because we see a growth in HSIs in the Midwest, and that's what we're going to be paying attention to today. Our research approach, we analyze secondary data and the literature on HSIs and EHSIs. We'll focus on the North Central region, and also we'll focus specifically on Illinois, where there is a high concentration of HSIs. We also survey the faculty and administration of HSIs and EHSIs in the Midwest to examine how they are responding to the growth of the Latino students, the Latino community. And we targeted the faculty and the administrative staff because we wanted to look at how their role as teachers and in the form of education, teaching and research and outreach impacts the Latino community and what work they're doing in that area. We also visited a couple of HSIs and one of two emerging Hispanic Serving Institutions, and we did a site visit of that and talked to the people of those institutions and got on-site take on how they are engaged with the Latino community, and that was a real wonderful experience we had with the institutions that supported our work. We had the survey start in May, and it lasted. We had to pick it up again in the fall, and we went through December, and then we had a request for the data to survey to be granted one more to allow for more time. So we left it open till the 1st of February. So we're in that stage where we've analyzed some of the data, but we still have much more data to analyze. Again, let me just pick it up here and talk about some of the trends that talk about the causality of the emergence of Hispanic Serving Institutions. You see here that on the left column you have non-Hispanics, and then you have Hispanics, and this is the population. Then you have the U.S., and then you have the North Central region. And what you see here is that for the non-Hispanics, the growth over the 10-year period was 2.9, and nationally and in the region was 0.7. However, for Hispanics, it was 13.9 in the nation and 12.8 in the region. So it's much higher rates of population growth in the Hispanic population. We see, therefore, the same phenomenon by the states. If you look at the regions, the growth for Hispanics is much larger across all the states compared to the non-Hispanic population. We see here in terms of enrollment that the non-Hispanic enrollment change was 2.1% for the nation as a whole, and for the North Central region was minus 8.4%. However, Hispanic enrollment increased for the nation at 35% and 40% for the North Central region. And for Hispanic women, the increase was also about 35% nationally and almost 40% regionally. So those are the trends nationally with enrollment. That led to the growth of Hispanic Serving Institutions in the Midwest. We start in 2000 when there was 9 Hispanic Serving Institutions and 9 emerging Hispanic institutions. Since then, we've moved to 18 in Hispanic Serving Institutions in 2010 and 14 emerging Hispanic Serving Institutions. And now we are, as of 2016, with 29 Hispanic Serving Institutions and 49 emerging Hispanic Serving Institutions, all measured in terms of enrollment. And these are numbers provided to us from HACU, the association that supports the advocacy for Hispanic Serving Institutions. Here you have a picture of the Hispanic Serving Institutions and emerging Hispanic Serving Institutions by state. And the bulk of them is, as you see, both emerging and Hispanic Serving Institutions, as well as Hispanic Serving Institutions concentrated in Illinois. If we look at some of the characteristics of those institutions, we find for the North Central region, we find that religion is a factor here. Religious institutions account for 34.9% in the region, 20% for Hispanic Serving Institutions, and 43% for emerging Hispanic Serving Institutions. So those are the percentages of religious institutions that are involved as for the region, as well as our Hispanic Serving Institutions and emerging Hispanic Serving Institutions. This was the data set that we used from the Department of Education, and that's basically the data we used throughout this initial part of the presentation. If we look at other characteristics like sectors, we see that private and not-for-profit account for 52% of all institutions in the Midwest, compared to 38% for HSIs and 61% just about for emerging Hispanic Serving Institutions. That's the larger number, and you can see there the percentage of public two-year institutions. In HSIs, it's 51.7%, quite significant in the majority. Another characteristic is urbanization, and you see here that to a large extent, the Hispanic Serving Institutions and emerging Hispanic Serving Institutions are located in the city and urban, suburban areas. So now we want to look at what I call Latino community development outcomes, and these are topics of college access and degree completion and employment of Latinos in higher education. So some of these indicators here are viewed in terms of the view of Hispanic Serving Institutions as an academic project. Here we want to view these as a community development project, because college access or college education and degree completion and employment are key indicators of community development, or indicators of community development. So what do we have here? What we see and what the story will tell is that to a large extent, you have, we're going to be doing national and Midwest comparisons first. And we see here that in 2016, there was 15,919,000 undergraduates enrolled in the fall of 2016. And the Midwest accounted for 21% of that. Okay. Now, in 2016, there was, out of the 15.9 million students, there was 18.2% that were Hispanic, and 10.4% that were Hispanic women, okay, at the national level. At the regional level, out of the 3.4 million fall enrollment undergrads in 2016, 7.9% were Hispanic and 4.5% are Hispanics. So in the Midwest, Hispanics account for 9.4% of all Hispanics in the nation, and for 9.3% of all Hispanic women enrolled in education in the nation. So this is significant. This is just giving you some basic data so we can understand the impacts in a minute. When we look at degrees, we have associate's degrees, and there was in 2017, 854,831 awarded. Well, 19.4% went to Latinos. With bachelor's, out of the 1.8 million, 12.3% went to Latinos. At the region, out of the 174 1,000 or so degrees, 7.7% went to Latinos for associate degrees, and out of the bachelor degrees, out of the 414,919, 5.6% went to Latinos. So if you look at how the region compares to the nation, well, 20.4% of all associate degrees were produced in the region. Out of the, as far as the bachelor's degrees, 23% of all the bachelor degrees were produced in the region. I'm sorry. Yes. And as far as Hispanic degrees, bachelor degree earned, 10.4% of all the degrees earned were earned in the Midwest. So significant representation here of the production of degrees in the Midwest. If we look at employment of Latino faculty or instructional staff with Latino status, we see that there was a total of 82,000 instructional staff with faculty status nationally and 158 regionally. And that 158 makes up 23% of all instructional staff with faculty status in the nation. Now, out of the 689,000 instructional staff, 4.6% were Hispanic. And out of that same total, 2.3% were Hispanic women, okay, at the national level. When you compare the regional figures, you have 2.8% of the 328 instructional staff with faculty status be Hispanics, and 1.3% are Hispanic women. Okay, so that's how it breaks down. If you look at tenure, you have in 2016 a total of 300,000 individuals with tenure, and we have here 71,000 in the North Central region. So 23.7% of all the tenure faculty were from the North Central region. Out of the 300,269, 4.5% were tenured faculty that were Latino, and out of that total of 200,269, 2% were Latino women. At the regional level, we had only 2.9% of all tenured faculty Latinos, and 1.2% of all Latino faculty be Latino faculty women. Okay, so those are the numbers. Now, how is it that the Midwest is doing in terms of performance, in terms of fall enrollment? Well, if you look at these figures, what we have is the North Central region, non-Hispanic serving institutions, and the North Central region, Hispanic serving institutions. So the total of these two is the total in the North Central region. So we have for undergraduates, 3,254,626. At the national level, about 2.6% were Hispanic undergraduates at the national level. And out of the total of 3.2 million undergraduate students enrolled in the fall of 2016, 3.5% were undergraduate Hispanic women. If we look at Hispanic and North Central region Hispanic serving institutions, the share of the 170,000 undergraduate students was 40.7%, okay? And the share of the 170 undergraduate students that were Hispanic women was 24%. So a significant, much higher number of enrollment in Hispanic serving institutions, okay? The other point to point out is that for undergraduates, the North Central region accounts for 5% of the total of the 33.2 million or so institutions or students enrolled. But if you look at Hispanic serving institutions, you find that they make up 34% of the undergraduates in the North Central region. And they make up, the women in the Hispanic serving institutions make up 36% of the women enrolled in 2016 for the North Central region altogether, the non-Hispanic serving institutions. Okay, so a significant share of fall enrollment is being captured by Hispanic Serving Institutions. And if we move to degrees awarded, we find that nationally, there was 160,000 associate degrees or so awarded, and of that, Latinos made up 5.3%. This is for non-Hispanic serving institutions in the North Central region. We compare that to the Hispanic serving institutions in the North Central region, and we find that out of the 14,209 institutions, 7.7 degrees, awarded, 7.7% of the degrees went to Hispanics, associate degrees. And we see also that out of the 9,364 degrees, bachelor degrees awarded in the North Central region Hispanic serving institutions, 1.9% of those were Latino, went to Latino students, Latino women, or Latino overall, okay? So that's how that breaks down. Even though the numbers are small, we see that the Hispanic serving institution degrees as a percentage of the non-Hispanic serving institutions is quite significant, okay? 59% of all the degrees came from Hispanic serving institutions, and with regard to associate's degrees and with regard to bachelor's degrees, 12.2% came from Hispanic serving institutions. If we look at employment, we see here that in the North Central region, non-Hispanic serving institutions, we have a total of 15,334 faculty, instructional staff with faculty status, and 2.7% of that are Hispanic or Latino, and 1.2% of that are Hispanic or Latino women. So that's in the North Central region in the case of non-Hispanic serving institutions. If we compare it with Hispanic serving institutions, the percentage of staff with faculty status that's Hispanic is much greater. 6.6% of the 4,994 were Hispanic, and 3.4% of the 4,994 were Hispanic. So a significant number of instructional staff are Hispanic at Hispanic serving institutions compared to non-Hispanic serving institutions. We also see that the number of tenured faculty, the percent of the total is much higher in Hispanic serving institutions compared to non-Hispanic serving institutions. For example, we had 68,548 tenured faculty in 2016, and out of that, 2.8% were Hispanic and 2.2% were Hispanic women. But in Hispanic serving institutions in the Midwest, 6.8% of all the tenured faculty were Hispanic, and 3.7% of all Hispanic faculty were Hispanic Latino women. So again, we see that with Hispanic serving institutions, the percentages are much higher compared to the non-Hispanic serving institutions. With regard to emerging Hispanic serving institutions, we see the same patterns, all right? Meaning that the share of undergraduate Hispanic total and the share of Hispanic women, it's much higher in the emerging Hispanic serving institutions compared to the non-emerging Hispanic serving institutions in the North Central region. So you see the numbers here in terms of percentages, and we see that the share is much greater, as one would expect. If we look at degrees awarded, we have again the emerging Hispanic serving institutions and the non-emerging Hispanic serving institutions, and we have degrees here, and the associate degrees for non-emerging Hispanic serving institutions was 149,735. Out of those, 4.6% went to Latinos. With regard to bachelor's degrees, there was 383,064 awarded in 2016. Out of those, 4.5% went to Latinos. And we see that for the emerging Hispanic serving institutions in the North Central region, the shares are much higher. So that's a significant indicator of the extent to which there's an influence of growth in the number of degrees awarded in emerging Hispanic serving institutions compared to non-emerging Hispanic serving institutions. With regard to instructional faculty and faculty status, we see the same thing, although not as pronounced. We see that, for example, out of the 143,926 instructional staff and faculty status in the North Central region that was employed at non-emerging Hispanic serving institutions, 2.7% were Hispanic and 1.2% were Hispanic or Latino women. However, we compare it to the emerging Hispanic serving institutions in the North Central region, the percentage of the grand total that is Hispanic is a bit higher, 3.1 and 1.4 compared to 1.2. And let me say that these are census data, so these are national totals. They are not percentages here in terms of a sample. We're dealing with the census of institutions. Okay. With regard to tenure, we see the pattern again here. We see that out of, for example, the 64,189 tenure faculty that existed in that were employed at non-emerging Hispanic serving institutions in the North Central region, 2.8% were Hispanic and 1.1% were Latino. Well, when we look at emerging Hispanic serving institutions, the percentage is a bit higher, 3.2% compared to 2.8%, as well as for Latinos overall, as well as for Latino women, the percentage is higher, 1.3% compared to 1.1%. So we see that in the case of these three indicators, or four indicators, in the case of tenured faculty, in the case of instructional staff that has faculty status, in the case of degrees awarded, and in the case of enrollment, the share that is being produced by Hispanic serving institutions and emerging Hispanic serving institutions is much larger than, or is relatively larger compared to non-Hispanic serving institutions or non-emerging Hispanic serving institutions in the Midwest. So I'd like to change the focus from assessment of individuals and how the Hispanic serving institutions and emerging Hispanic serving institutions have impacted the production of these variables that indicate community development, to looking at a different way of analyzing community impact. And here we look at communities themselves. So what we do here is consider the state of Illinois, and we wanted to look at, we took the sample of institutions in Illinois, and we identified those census tracts that had a Hispanic serving institution and those census tracts that did not have a Hispanic serving institution. And we then decided to compare certain indicators to see if there was a difference in these indicators between Hispanic serving institution census tracts and those institutions in census tracts that don't have Hispanic serving institutions, that have a non-Hispanic serving institutions. So let me clarify that. We are comparing non-Hispanic serving institution tracts to Hispanic serving institution tracts. And we wanted to see if there was any difference in indicators. And what were these indicators? There were four types of indicators. The share of Hispanic population, was attainment of Hispanics, poverty rates, and the median income, as well as Hispanic aged individuals ages 18 to 24. So what did we find when we compared the census tracts that had Hispanic serving institutions to the census tracts that had institutions that were non-Hispanic serving? Well, we identified 24 tracts that had Hispanic serving institutions, And then we identified 126 tracts that had no Hispanic serving institution, or that had a non-Hispanic serving institutions. And we assumed that there was no significant difference between these two groups of institutions. And what did we find? Well, with regard to the percentage of Hispanics between these two communities, the Hispanic Serving Institution communities and the non-Hispanic Serving Institution communities, we did a t-test, and the results show that the p-value is less than 5%, which means that there is only a 1.3% chance that two groups have no significant difference. So basically, the data tells us that the higher mean percentage of Hispanics, that we have a higher mean percentage of Hispanics that are in communities with Hispanic serving institutions, which makes sense. The share of the population in tracts that have a Hispanic serving institution is higher than in the case where there's a non-Hispanic serving institution. And you can see that both in the means as well as in the t-values, t-test values. If we compare another indicator of community economic development, we assume that there is no difference in poverty rate of Hispanics between the Hispanic serving institution tracts and the non-Hispanic serving institution tracts. And the results show that, well, the mean is higher, but there is no statistical significantly difference. So this particular variable proves to be, there's no evidence that there is a statistical difference in the two communities. Our other variable was employment of rate of Hispanics between Hispanic serving institutions tracts and non-Hispanic serving institution tracts. And here we found that it was statistically significant that there is a difference in the employment rate of Hispanics between these two types of communities. So we were demonstrating that the employment rate is higher in Hispanic serving institutions compared to the employment rate in non-Hispanic serving institutions, communities. And we also compared whether there was a statistically significant difference in educational attainment, associate degrees of Hispanics between these two groups. And we did find a statistically significant relationship, okay? So we find that Hispanic serving institution communities have a higher rate of, are associated with higher rates of associate degree, as well as higher degrees of bachelor degrees. So the percentage of individuals that are Hispanic that have associate degrees are higher where we have Hispanic serving institutions compared to communities compared to where we have Hispanic serving institution, non-Hispanic serving institution communities. And the same thing is true for bachelor's degrees. The percentage of Hispanic serving institution communities have a higher percentage of Hispanics with bachelor degrees compared to Hispanic serving institution, non-Hispanic serving institution communities and the degrees, bachelor degrees that they have. So we see here that we are showing an impact of Hispanic serving institutions on the community. With regard to bachelor's degrees, the same thing. There is a statistically significant difference in terms of educational attainment, in terms of bachelor's degree attainment of Hispanics. Hispanics that are in Hispanic serving institution communities have a higher rate of bachelor degrees compared to Hispanics that reside in non-Hispanic serving institution communities. We also found that there is a statistically significant difference in median household income of Hispanics between those Hispanics living in Hispanic serving institution census tracts compared to those living in Hispanic serving institution non-census tracts. And that's reflected in terms of the p-values. And with regard to the we wanted to test if there was a significant difference in the share of Hispanic population ages 18 to 24 between the two groups. And here we found that the share of Hispanic people ages 18 to 24 is higher in Hispanic Serving Institution affected communities, though the means of this value is higher. So although we were not able to prove that there's statistical significance, the means are higher. So we've basically been able to speak to our analysis of secondary data. We've looked at the Illinois case and tried to demonstrate how using statistical analysis, we can show that there is an impact by Hispanic Serving Institutions on the communities that they serve, not so much in terms of students, but the actual communities. And we've looked at certain indicators that demonstrate that there is a statistical significance in census tracts that have Hispanic Serving Institutions compared to census tracts that have non-Hispanic Serving Institutions in terms of indicators of community economic development, like degree attainment, median income, and the other variables I mentioned. So I want to give Steve enough time to speak, so I'm going to basically introduce now a little bit of what we tried to do in the survey, which we administered, like I say, we sent that out in May, and then we picked it up again in the fall. We wanted to look at how it is that the faculty and the university is engaged with the Latino community. And we wanted to target the faculty to see how it is through their instruction, through their outreach, and through their research that they are engaged with the Latino community. We were thinking at the time that that was the closest we could get at trying to get a handle on how they are contributing to community economic development through their community engagement. This was sort of, given attention because of the literature that exists out there on the engaged community. So we wanted to look at engaged scholarship in terms of research. And we wanted to look at service learning in terms of focusing on how teaching is engaged with the Latino community. And we wanted to look at public service and how the institutions and faculty are servicing the Latino community. So Steve is going to take it from here. He's a much more articulate speaker than I am. So we'll hand it over to Steve and he can take it from here. We'll take questions at the end.
Thanks, Renee. So when we did our site visits with these communities, thing that came up a lot was that the faculty, the administrative and all, were really interested in how embedded better understanding how embedded they are in those communities. And they've made efforts to do that, at least in the few cases where we visited, but kind of didn't really have a sense of what that looked like over time. And so in our survey, we kind of wanted to get a sense of what it was like, what are they doing, some of the things, the teaching things they're doing that engage with these communities, what are some of the research-oriented kinds of things they're doing, and what are some of the outreach-oriented kind of things. And so we tried to engage EHSIs and HSIs in the North Central region, and we had 10 universities that participated, and we had 147 people participate overall. Although 4 of them accounted for 76% of the respondents. And so we have really good data for those 4 institutions, not as much for the others that participated, but overall, we could see some things that they were happening. Quite a few were faculty, over half, quite a few administrators, 21%, and then a mix of academic specialists and non-faculty positions were also folks that participated. 3/4 were full-time, 28.6% were tenured, and then another third were on tenure track but weren't tenured yet. We had quite a few that were, we had 16.7% that were professors, that were associate professors, 16 that were assistant professors, 8 instructors. No, I'm sorry, I got that screwed up. It's 16.7% were professors, associate was 6.5, assistant professor was 8.3, and literally a third were instructors. So they were playing faculty roles, but weren't necessarily on a ranked faculty. And then 77% of the respondents in our study were Hispanic. So we were hearing mostly from the faculty, staff, and administrators that were Latino, primarily in these institutions in which we were working. So when we tried to get a sense of the teaching, it's really kind of teaching that related to their specific kinds of engagement. So 31% said they had service learning opportunities for their students, and then of those 31%, 60% had some service opportunities for students in Latino neighborhoods. Now, since a lot of the schools were located in communities where there are higher numbers of Latinos, we would expect to see more of that. And then of the 17% had other kinds of things like internships, practicums, and placements and those things. And then almost 2/3 of those as well were available to Latino students. And then on the research side, we're looking at, well, how engaged are they in research? A number of the schools, quite a few of the schools aren't really research institutions, but they do have some research capacity, and they are doing some research. And there weren't a lot of faculty that were leading research projects as PIs or co-PIs, but a number are doing things such as training their students for research. And then some are using research to respond to the Latino community, 15%. And then how extent are they engaged with the land-grant universities? Because most of at least in the North Central region, the land-grant universities are all pretty much heavily engaged in research, and 6.2% were engaged with researchers at land-grant universities. And I know from the site visits we've done, there's a lot more interest at these institutions in terms of engaging with larger research institutions and land grants and better understanding the issues in the communities in which they're embedded, and also in terms of better exploring the roles that they can play institutionally and as faculty in terms of engaging with the communities in which their institutions are embedded. And then outreach related questions, we had some that were talking about their partnerships with Latino communities and organizations. 17% said they were doing that. There's a lot of interest in that, but not much knowledge in how to do it. And then almost 22% are delivering some service to the Latino community. So when we started asking them about their institutions, one of the questions we asked them was, is the institute making a difference in terms of developing the talent of Latino students? And you can see by this that about almost 68% either agree or strongly agree with that particular statement. And the numbers don't change a lot when you go to, are they showing evidence of commitment to institutional cultural change in support of a broad agenda focused on serving Hispanic students? Is showing evidence of institutional cultural change in support of a broad agenda focused on serving Hispanic students? Effectively assists faculty with improving the recruitment, retention, completion rates, and you start to see that that's changed a lot, where 30% are saying don't really agree or disagree with that, and 24% either disagree or strongly disagree with that. And there's still some that agree with that, and others that strongly agree with that, but you don't see the same kind of support around that. And that was evidenced as well in some of the comments we got that we'll talk about a little bit. And then some of these, my institution has not achieved its full potential in educating Latinos. That's pretty, there's pretty good support for that. Basically saying we've got work to do in terms of being able to say we've reached our potential. In advancing the study of Latinos, again, they've got work to do. And then also in engaged, diverse, diversity changes with a significant emphasis on the success of underrepresented students, including Latino. And so there's still quite a bit of work to do in that particular arena. They feel like they're doing some things well, but they also feel like there's a lot more work to do. So we had some open-ended questions too to get their perspective really kind of on what the engagement stuff looks like in their communities from where they sit. And so these are the questions that we kind of talked on. The first one kind of focuses more on engagement with Latinos. The second one is really kind of looking at any kind of a project they're working on. And a lot of the faculty, even the staff, are engaged in outreach kinds of things in which they're. So we wanted to talk about those things that they were pretty excited about. We wanted to talk about the assets they had, any strategic advantages they had, ways that they could be more helpful in facilitating engagement. Really kind of what are some of the barriers that they face in addressing the community development needs of Latinos, and then also to talk a little bit about opportunities. And so what I did was we kind of organized them into strengths, the comments. We kind of did some review, and what we came up with was really what are some of the strengths, barriers, opportunities, and what were some of the strategies they talked about. So when they talked about strengths, a lot of it came down to the teaching. They're doing things specific to the Latino experience. They're developing some service learning programs that engage with Latino student organizations. They feel like they've got quite a bit of talent in their community, staff, some institutional support, although that's a little uneven. They say a lot of good things about their students and the community leaders. The location being embedded right in the midst of these communities, which many of the HSIs and EHSIs, they feel like is a strength. They have a growing student body, particularly of the Latino groups. A lot of the institutions are really interested in cultivating that because it does tend to be the largest growing group of students in most communities. Some are talking about their alumni and how they're alumni are helping them connect more directly to the communities and to recruit students and to develop resources on their campuses, as well as serving role models for their students. Some have programs where they're hiring some alumni to fill teaching and other kinds of positions on their campus. They're making some inroads in services and programs, but this is uneven as well. And then they feel like their institutions are sometimes committed to leadership. It's committed to the development of their capacity to reach this community more. Some of the barriers, few resources. A lot of what's going on is happening kind of with few institutional resources committed to it. There's issues of consistency in the leadership. There were stories of, we had a center that was established. It was open for a year, and then they stopped funding it, and it caused some churn in terms of the kinds of messaging they're giving their students, faculty, and others, and even the communities. Acculturation. There's talk about quite a few of the non-Latino faculty not being engaged. The need for more role models in personnel, but also in terms of how the Latino experience is represented in the curriculum and in programs. Community trust. They talked a little bit about their institutions not necessarily being trusted by the Latino community in which they're bedded. They're getting students from these communities, but the communities themselves aren't engaging with them. Some of this relates back to this idea of consistency from the institution and leadership, and that tends to be a bigger issue with some of these institutions. And then the diversity of the faculty and staff tended to be an issue as well. When we think about opportunities, they talk a lot about internal development and engagement. So how do they think about the capacity building there, developing materials, communicating with the families of the students they have and those that they would like to recruit, support services that make it easier for Latinos to participate in programs, creating welcoming environments, and then intentionality and planning and outreach. And that a lot of what's going on in terms of their outreach is happening because a few good faculty are connecting to these communities. Some cases, institutions are making investments, but they talk a little bit about really needing more intentionality in terms of how do we as a HSI or an EHSI really connect more to these communities. And academic programs. There's more need for courses, internships, other kinds of things that connect, that make contributions and connect to experiences and needs of the Latino community. Service learning programs and advising, there's a lot of room for growth in those areas. Collaboration with community partners. Some have some pretty good, strong collaborations, but for the most part, what we were hearing from the folks at these institutions is there's really a lot more work to do here. How do they connect to these communities? Are there things they can do in terms of research? Are there things that they can do in the service learning field that can be good for the students, the institution, and the HSI, as well as the organizations in the community? And location. They just don't feel like they're taking advantage of the location as much as they need to, as most of them are within or very near to really vibrant Latino communities. So strategies. Some are around academic programs, coursework focused on the Latino experience, or Latin American studies programs, or incorporating culture and other kinds of experiences into the curriculum itself. Staff development is a big place for strategies. How do you increase awareness among the diversity of student experiences with the staff and the faculty in there? Work issues to deal with some of the acculturation issues, resources for that. And then also there's a lot of room to hire more diverse faculty. Outreach, connections to community organizations, community leaders, doing things that highlight those relationships, that create opportunities for employment and other kinds of stuff with organizations and businesses in the community. Those are the kinds of things that are really thinking are strategies. Institutional leadership, there's really uneven in terms of how institutions are thinking about their role in these communities. You know, when we did we did a summit in Chicago back in November, and that came up a lot. We had about a 2-hour discussion period, and this issue was a big focus of that. It was really focused on, well, what do we do as an institution? How do we position ourselves? How do we approach this? What would an engaged institution look like that has the capacity to reach these communities effectively, contribute to community development? At the time, we didn't have the data put together that Renee had talked about, where the impacts on some of these community development indicators, that those are helpful in terms of helping these institutions better think about how they can impact some of these communities. And then student support and development, financial aid packages, support systems. Some of the schools are really thinking, well, what are some of the specific supports that a Latino student needs that might be a little different than some of the other students they have in their community, in their institution? Clubs, bilingual faculty, staff, and what is it going to take to make our campus a more welcoming climate? These were, there's a lot of work left to do with both the data that we've got, but when we visited with these institutions, they're really hungry for better understanding of what they can do, how they can do it, what others are doing, how they're doing it, and those kinds of things. When Renee started this work, we didn't realize that there was as little out there in terms of research and understanding of what these experiences was like as we found out. I think that's it for us, unless Renee has any more comments. Did you have anybody have any comments or questions?
Thank you, Steve. Let me just add that we had a wonderful summit in in Chicago, and we want to acknowledge the support we received from Wilbur Wright College in that effort. We had representation from all over the Midwest by different faculty, and we had over 100 and some participants. And we also made a presentation in June of last year with Cambio de Colores conference, where we spoke about some of our preliminary work at that time. So those are a couple of outcomes from this project that have also occurred since over the course of this time. But we'll open it up for questions.
Well, thank you, Renee and Stephen. We really appreciate sharing all of the data and what's going on with these institutions. As we're waiting for any questions from the participants, I had two questions. The first is, there was an indication in one of your slides that the community or community leaders did not trust the institution. Mm-hmm. Just wondering what you're feeling about why that might be, or what the institution could do to help build those bridges and increase trust. And the second piece is, in a broader context, the student debt has been a growing concern nationwide, and I'm wondering how the Hispanic institutions are matching up, and the Hispanic students, how are their debt loads? Is that something that you had considered as part of your work?
Okay, let me respond, and Steve, you're welcome to chime in here. Regarding the trust issue, I spoke earlier about how one way to view Hispanic Serving Institutions is in terms of it being a political project. And I spoke in context of the national level and the legislation to make room for these institutions in legislation so that we can fund them better. So that's the type of issue that's occurring at the national level. But within institutions themselves, there's also some type of political project going on. You have the grassroots faculty and staff doing all they can, and then you have the administrators dealing with issues of board of trustees and issues of trying to get buy-in at that level. So from my perspective, I think that the grassroots faculty and leadership at that level don't think that the administration is necessarily moving fast enough to embrace some of the suggestions that are being made. And perhaps that's where some of that trust issue comes in. Maybe Steve can elaborate on that. But that's my take on the trust issue.
I would also say that in visiting with some of the faculty and staff, they feel like some of the trust issues come from a lack of consistency in terms of how they're dealing with some of the communities in which they're embedded. So they might get a grant to do a project in a neighborhood for a while, but then when it's done, they're not there. Or a faculty member might have a nice service learning program that goes on for a while, but then that faculty member moves on and it's not picked up. So some of those consistency things have a way of eroding trust and making it difficult to do things over time. The other has to do with the extent to which they're engaged in the community itself. Are they supporting some of the institutions and resources in those particular neighborhoods? Part of it is building trust in these communities is being present, and sometimes the institutions aren't as present as they need to be if they want to really make inroads with with these communities, particularly if you're recruiting their kids to come and study in your school. You really kind of have to be present, and overcoming the trust issues is a really big deal in terms of being able to adequately or appropriately serve these communities.
Regarding the cost issue, definitely, it's an issue that is impacting the Latino community's ability to attend education. And Hispanic Serving Institutions, a lot of them, mostly, at least in the Midwest, as you saw, over 50% of them are community colleges. So cost is a big consideration for them, and that's why that's why the growth in these institutions. That's a key. Open access is another reason why, in addition to cost, open access and being able to attend these community colleges and other institutions without necessarily having to take ACT tests or entrance exams is another reason. And the fact that a lot of these institutions don't have the state support that other institutions may have, or the federal support, feeds into issues that relate to the question you ask. Raquel has a question. Steve, you want to answer that?
Raquel has a question.
Yeah.
We have a summary evaluation for the participants. It'd be great to get some feedback from you on the webinar.
So on Raquel's question about recruitment strategy, some are, one of the schools we visited, their goal at the time was to become an EHSI, and they were developing policies literally at the leadership level to make the kinds of investments they needed to move into that category. Others, they're not real pleased about it, and we saw that at the summit we had. Some institutions see it as a designation, something that, you know, a part of who they are, and others see it more as a label, and see it as being a challenge for them. And so for those that are interested in developing their Latino student populations, yeah, they are doing some recruiting strategies. Some are actively trying to become EHSIs and HSIs by recruiting specifically in those communities. Now, having said that, a lot of these institutions are in neighborhoods like the community colleges or some of the smaller four liberal arts schools are in communities that have a high Latino population. So, and they tend to, their student body tends to come from those communities. And so they're looking at how they can better reach or connect to those communities so that they can bring those students in as well.
Well, I don't see another question coming in. Raquel says thank you. And so maybe now is a good time to bring the webinar to a close. Thanks, everyone, for joining, and thank you, Renee and Steve, for pulling together all this information and engaging in this work. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Mark.
All right. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
You too. Bye-bye.
Thanks.